Okay, well, good morning all. Welcome to the round 3 Replan paybacks for the large suppliers. And thank you all for sparing the time for this. I'm very conscious that probably some of you won't know me. My name's Giles Claydon and I joined the programme probably now about 6 months ago as the Deputy Programme Manager supporting Keith. And I've been very closely involved in the extensive replan that's been going on over the last quarter and more. Before we go into this morning, I just wanted to sort of give you a quick overview of the playback session that we've got planned today. So we can move on to the first slide, please. Thanks, Joe. So we've got welcome and introductions, and immediately after that, I'm going to hand over to Jenny just to give a very brief 4 or 5 minutes just on the sponsor's position around. No. Oh, can you hear?
And I got everything off my chair.
Right.
She said at the end, anyone, a more positive. I wanted to tell you with positive feedback we have in medical tubing and how much we value you as producers.
Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. I shall start again. So, I don't think that was Jenny speaking either. So, in terms of the agenda this morning, a very brief welcome and introductions from myself. We've got Jenny Booth from Ofgem, who's going to just provide a brief sponsor message just to start this playback. And then I'm going to hand over to Keith Clark, who I'm sure you all know really well from all the various sessions along the way to get to this point. And then I'm going to pick up with a high-level, giving you a high-level overview of the plan. That's very much by reference to the plan on a page that I'm sure you may have seen in the implementation approach. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, each of the SME leads, who will introduce themselves as they pick up each section. We've got about 6 or 7 sections to work through there. And then we've assigned some time for wrap up and QA. Having said that, I think we will pause as we go through each of the presentations for questions. But I would say if we start to feel like we're getting behind on the agenda, I'm really keen to cover the full extent of the content that we prepared for you today, so you get a complete end-to-end view across the plan. I may well pull that short, maybe defer questions to the end at that point, but hopefully we can keep those in proportion to the presentations that we have. You'll see as we go through this, a lot of the material is drawn from the implementation approach, but it's clear from some of the feedback that we've already had that I think some elaborations during the session will be quite useful. So we have updated, or there are amendments to a couple of the slides that we'll talk through as we get there, but that's been done really because we think it'd be incredibly useful to yourselves to have that sort of the latest thinking really borne out in those changes. We are also, as you may have noted, recording this session, and as we've done on previous playbacks, we will publish this on the portal. So generally, we're going to try and aim for about an hour doing a formal presentation and a last half hour for any wash up and wrap up. Are there any questions at this stage? Okay, thank you. If we can move on then to sponsor message. So Jenny, I think this is over to you. If you perhaps just give us 3 or 4 minutes from Ofgem's perspective, just in terms of where we're at and the focus from your side.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Giles. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, so I'm Jenny Booth. I'm now the head of HHS at Ofgem. I've been around for a little while in Ofgem, for those who don't know me, just over 20 years. And this is one, I think it's the 3rd major transformational program that I'm working on. So in regards of HHS, this is one of the most significant programs that is going to impact the retail market going forward. And in relation to the plan, we are really keen to ensure that parties do fully participate in these playback sessions, because the objective here is for the plan to come to Ofgem and the plan needs to be a credible, robust plan. And the only way for the programme and industry to achieve that is if everybody plays their part, and particularly providing the necessarily granular information to the programme so that a detailed analysis can be done. So we then, when the plan is presented to us for approval, we've got all the necessary information there for us to actually make a fully informed decision. You guys have seen the slides. So one of the two things that I really want to put out is the timelines. They are quite constrained. We are looking to make a decision on the plan in the next 2 to 3 months. So we really want you to sort of put in the resources where necessary to actually get that information into the programme. The second point I want to pull out is that BAYS have an extremely keen interest in this programme. I can't stress that enough. It's now getting to the stage of having weekly meetings with BAYS where they are asking me questions about the programme, the timelines, migration approach, the impact on other programmes like the flexibility programme and so on. And to be totally candid, they want this program to be implemented as soon as possible. That's their single line. Let's get this program in as soon as possible. So, like I said, there is not only a keen interest, there's a strategic interest from different factors and different quarters in BAYS to actually make sure this program is implemented. Therefore, they are keen to understand the plan timelines, and go back to where I started. We really want this plan to be robust with sufficient analysis there, and the program can only do that if they've got that granular information there from industry parties. Essentially, work collaboratively and let's get the plan out there, and welcome all of your input into this process. That's it, I think, Giles. I don't think anyone's going to ask me any questions, so we can move on quite quickly.
Okay, Jenny, I will just give anybody an opportunity just to ask any questions at this point before we move on. Okay, I don't see any hands, Jenny, so thank you. And moving on to the next slide, please, and the next section. Thanks, Joe. So, Keith, I think this is over to you.
Giles, good morning, everybody. Just to be fair to Giles, I'll make sure it's only 5 minutes. Some of this stuff you've seen before, but just to pick out a few things. Jenny's already mentioned the expectation about the plan being realistic, but as quickly delivered as quickly as possible. We are making sure that Ofgem are aware of what's going on in the planning process and the conversations, but they are reserving their opinion on the process until the point where we formally engage with them on the plans. So this is more just to de-risk the amount of time that Ofgem will be required to take their decision. Ultimately, the more we can let them know about the conversations at this stage, the better, but it doesn't constitute their acceptance or otherwise of what we're doing at this stage, just to make that very clear. The round 3 artifacts are much more advanced this time. I think you probably realise they're quite heavy. But I would say also that it's been made very clear by Neil Lawrence and Ofgem that we need responses to this consultation. I'll come on more to that in a minute. So this is the last part in a 3-part consultation, and we are very keen to get this plan through. But the plan at the moment is to provide the information to Ofgem around the end of March at this stage, according to the plan that was given to PSG. The objectives of this consultation are to consult on the artefacts that we now have, and also to gauge the feasibility and alignment of participants' delivery plans, especially their DBT plans, and that will also form an input to the M3 decision that will be made at PSG soon. So it's very important we constructed the consultation to ask questions about participants' DBT plans and readiness, and to ask for evidence on that as well. It's also to assess the interest in participation from participants to form this MVC in SIT. And then, as you know, we have 2 deadlines, the 16th of January and the 31st of January. We'd like to get as many responses in by the 16th as possible. Those participants clearly will be more able on the front foot in terms of responding on evidence, one would hope. But those participants who respond later, but by the end of January, won't be precluded from participation. So next slide, very briefly, and you'll see most of the stuff, so I don't need to go through it. We've explained how the artifacts have developed since round 2. The important thing is the implementation approach, from which we're showing excerpts today to try and bring everything together. But we think you'll find that the planning, the milestone register, the grade, and everything is more specific, heavier, more granular. We've tried to make the consultation questions easier to answer and more targeted as well. But we do expect everybody in line with obligations to respond to this consultation. And at the end of the round 3 process, programme steering group will be made aware explicitly of those participants who have not provided responses. It's really important to kind of track this, because this is an industry programme and we do want to work with you in a very engaged way to deliver this together. But your part of that contract essentially is to engage and to respond to requests from the programme. It's really important we get that. We don't want to be making, in the silo decisions about the plan. This should be based on what you've told us. And we do expect also in this quarter for this plan to start following what working groups are discussing. Up until now, the plan has presumed and made assumptions about detailed delivery approaches through the next 2-3 months. We expect things like SIT working group, qualification working group, migration working group to discuss in detail some of these delivery approaches and reach consensus on them, so that the ultimate baseline plan follows those policy making discussions that are happening through governance. So the difference now is that we should expect to be much more interreliant with working groups and trying to reach that kind of industry consensus and, if you like, explore more of the details. So this playback is really about the plan, but the working groups will talk about much more of the detail. Okay, that's it for me.
Great, thanks, thanks, Keith. So moving on to talk through the high-level programme plan. So I'm sure for those of you that have read and seen the implementation approach, you'll essentially recognise this plan on a page for the programme. Before we go too much further, this is a slightly amended plan that you saw. There's no change in the dates. We made 2 minor amendments to this. The first is around what will probably appear to you as the burgundy coloured swim lane right in the centre of the plan, which relates to LDSO pre-migration testing. And there is some additional content there to explain that, and Dom will be covering that off in more detail when we get to the SIT testing. We also, I think it may have been Graham or Chris that very kindly fed back to us that we'd made a slight error around CP3. So the top box around CP3 is being corrected to read September 25. We originally had an error in there saying that was July 25. So I think it's useful for me to give a brief overview of what we are trying to present through this plan on a page. What you see on here is essentially 3 critical paths that show the different routes and through the programme, depending on whether participants elect to proceed into the SIT approach, or whether they choose to proceed through some migration via the qualification approach. And there's an interim line in there. So the plan itself is based on what we have been terming for some time now as a minimum viable cohort. And that cohort comprises of the minimum number of participants needed to functionally exercise and test all the central core systems. How that's comprised, again, Don will cover off in more detail when we get there, but essentially the stage that we are at the moment, and this is the key focus, one of the key focuses of the current replan, is to ensure that through the expressions of interest in SIT, that we can end up with a feasible minimum viable cohort in order to take us through the various SIT testing stages that you see within the plan here. So the fastest and quickest path to migration is to elect to proceed through SIT. And this path shows you in the very heavy dotted line the earliest entry into the into the migration stage. And this is really small on my screen, and I'm going to make sure I get the right dates here reading off in April 2005. The next fastest path, and there's probably a fairly obvious statement to make, would be for those participants who choose not to go through SIT, but elect to take the qualification approach, and they are potentially further ahead in their DBT plans and end up in the first tranche to go through qualification. The final and probably the critical path, and for the purists amongst you, probably for the programme as a whole, and the critical path to the new settlement code is actually shown by the heavy red line at the end there, and that represents the last qualification tranche to go through. And of course, in the qualification tranche, those participants will not have gone through SIT. They've elected to go down the qualification path. And that shows the last tranche going through and entering into migration in January 2006. There are a number of assumptions here in terms of the timescales that we'll pick out as we go through the playback. So just to briefly step through each of the swim lanes here, we are currently very focused on the system build and design stage. There's a heavy focus at the moment on monitoring the plans for the central participants. Those are the 5 key central parties. But of course, as we go through the round 3 consultation, and it's clear who wants to elect to come into SIT, of course, the monitoring and the system implementation QA processes will shroud those participants as well. The main target in the stage is to have pit testing as the final stage of DBT complete for those participants that wish to go into SIT by the target date of the end of October, in order to enable us to start on the component integration testing that essentially starts the first phase of SIT testing. Moving on further down, there are various stages that comprise of SIT, but probably for the purposes of just this summary here, and Dom again will go into more detail as he goes through this. The key stage here is the need to get through the SIT functional testing in order to prove and exercise the overall core design, so that then feeds in and stands up the environment that forms the UIT environment for qualification. So the key thing is for us to be able to pass through SIT and out of SIT functional and get into qualification, get the environment stood up for qualification swiftly. The qualification route, the path, takes place from, I'm going to read the slide here, I hope it says January, it does say January, somebody correct me, this is hugely small. From January from 2025 through to January 2026. And our working assumption here remains that will be a year-long window. And part of the qualification path still needs to be worked up through the qualification working group, as Keith alluded to at the start. The timescale for each tranche of qualification, our assumption at the moment is that timescale is 6 months, with probably a month or two in either end, in order to shroud that testing with the standard governance through the PAB board, the Performance Assurance Board, that is hosted by Elexon. So, as you can see from this plan here, we have a bit of an elapsed time between the first participants who roll off SIT, and as you know, SIT is equivalent to qualification. That's very much at the core of the proposition through the Replan, and the first tranche that rolls off qualification. That elapsed time is about 8 months, and therein lies, I think, one of the very key benefits for those participants that choose to elect for SIT. I slightly skipped over the very narrow swim lane in Burgundy. That swim lane is for pre-migration testing for LDSOs that do not go through SIT. And again, we will say more about that, but it is essential that we have all LDSOs with a proven functionality in order to enable the SIT participants and themselves to go live at that early opportunity. The next swim lane in green is around regulatory and code drafting. As the plan alludes to here, many of these activities are not on the critical path, but probably the key thing that just to call out is that the code will need to be fully baseline before we enter into the first migration at M11. We then have migration that proceeds over the course of 18 months, and that is a change in our working assumption from the previous round two consultation. And we've done some preliminary and provisional modelling for that, which again has been taken through the migration working group, and Aid will talk more to that as we get to the migration section. And then finally, the final stage is having with all participants having migrated, we then have an elapsed time, a minimum of 2 months. It may be longer, and that's something that Jason again will and Aid will talk to at that stage of the deep dives. I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious I've covered quite a lot of material quite quickly, and we have a hand up as well. Thank you, Keith, for pointing that out to me. Chris, it's Chris, is it? Chris.
Hi there. Yeah, quick question on the milestone for the start of component integration testing. As you rightly outlined, I think the timeline is the 30th of October, and then I think you have to come out of pit exit by the 30th of September and then have a report produced, etc. So that's quite a black and white timeline in terms of getting into component integration and therefore SIT. But I think what we've seen in the working groups is that isn't the case, that it's going to be a cascade of certain parties being entered into component integration early and then a cascade through to suppliers probably like 6 to 8 weeks later or something of that nature. And I wanted to ask how black and white that cutoff is, because from a development and test point of view, from a supplier side, obviously the timelines are quite tight. So, you know, a month or 2 months in that space would be massively helpful, but I don't know whether it is a black and white cutoff for exit of pit into component integration on the 30th of October or not.
I won't speak. I think probably Dom might want to say something about this one, but obviously, Chris, as you and I discussed last week, it's important to try to set that timescale. This is the plan for consultation. We do want to know whether you can achieve that date or not. You know, in practicality, you're right that suppliers will come into CI later than the end of October, based on the plan that was already shared with the SIT working group. So certainly there's something to be discussed there at the SIT working group. But for the purposes of the consultation and the plan, we just want to make it black and white so that we can understand whether you can be ready at that point or not.
Yeah. That's good. Chris, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it just means that if that isn't the case and we can't be ready for that date, that we need to call out when we can be ready and what that means in terms of the plan. That's all.
But that's why we need the round 3 response, Chris, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, in your response, do make it clear the impact of that date, that date on you, and what your views are in relation to that impact and how you think you might match it. You can add how you think you might manage that if you wish. You know, the more opinion you give us back, the better, really.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Any more questions on the plan as a whole before we move on? Okay, thanks. Joe, could you move on, please? So we're now going to go into the walkthrough or the deep dive walkthrough of each of the programme phases, kicking off with design, build and test. So to kick off, I think, Paul, over to you.
Good morning all. My name is Paul Pettit. I head up the SI design team within the programme. What I'm going to cover off this morning is basically just a quick update on where we are with the design and what it means to you and how we can support you in your entry into design, build and test. So basically the design at the moment is currently looking to be signed off by the end of this month. So we'll have the work-off plan complete and the design approved from that point. We've already started working with a number of participants have already started their design. Some are further ahead than others, but we're really there to basically support you. We'll be doing a design assurance review of the design and participants design, and basically we'll be engaging with you over the next couple of months to basically bring out some guidance notes. And we're really there to support you in your understanding of the design. Make sure you know what you've got to build, where you can find artifacts that have been developed. We're there to also provide independent assurance to the programme about everybody's capability and where they are in going into PIT, because we're there to basically try and ensure that when you go into PIT SIT, it's a success. And so to that end, yeah, we'll be working with working with your architects, your BAs, just to ensure that, yeah, you understand the design. We'll do a review, and we're there, say, to support you in that, along with the design that gets issued and approved at the end of January. There will be a number of other artifacts made available to basically, hopefully, ease the digestion of the design. And so whether you're a large supplier, an LDSO, etc., you can focus on the aspects and the areas of the design that actually relate to you specifically. So we have the design mailbox, which we monitor that on a daily basis and respond to parties with their design queries, and that will continue throughout design, build, and test. And so, just really, we're really there to support you. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Nigel, who will take you through more about the testing side.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, I'm Nigel Hunt, working from the test team on the programme. I'll talk a little bit about PIT, where we are, and what it means to you guys. So first of all, obviously, PIT crosses everything, whether it's people coming into SIT or it's qualification. So we work very closely with the qualification code delivery body area as well on this. Now, the key thing that's coming out shortly in the end of January is the guidance document, pre-qualification guidance document. That will talk about how everyone can, what they need to do from a PIT perspective, which is obviously the testing part of DBT, whether it's one or two. That will come out and that'll be available for people to look at. Obviously free for questions to come out, but that'll be aligned whether it's for SIT purposes or for qualification. So it says DBT1, DBT2. DBT1 obviously is central parties and services, and DBT2 is more the sort of back-end systems with a lesser number of players being involved in that. Again, I'm hoping everyone's seen a lot of the slides that have come through here. DB2 is more about sort of back-end systems and consequential change. So PIT. So PIT, every system or service that is developed by programme participants must meet the end-to-end MHHS design and its interface in and out. Key point is the participants are responsible for managing their own testing process through PIT and the completion, and to be able to demonstrate that. And again, all that will be detailed within the guidance documents that will come out. And again, we'll work very closely with you guys to make sure it needs to work through and have an easy path through into SIT or through to qualification as may be. I guess it's sort of the key components. Obviously, it will have functional, non-functional. We've got regression in there. I think that's a sort of fairly key set of components. Happy to go through that in more detail, probably through the working groups. I think it's easier to talk through that. The PITs, as I said, is the participants are responsible for all their sort of systems, test environments, test data, scenario scripts, processes. Again, we will supply the guidance on how we will help you and assure you through into the various areas. Key deliverables from all participants, again, whether it's through into SIT or through qualification, is the approach to test plan, requirements traceability for testing, not just the requirements traceability that sort of Paul alluded to earlier, the scenarios and test scripts, regular reports. Oh, sorry. Joe,
Your presenting slide is not showing on the.
Sorry, I do apologise. Joe, can you go to the second slide now?
Oh, there you are.
Okay, sorry. Apologies for that. So hopefully it aligns to probably aligns to what I've just been talking about. So going to the sort of right hand side of this, the key components is the PIT approach, test plan, requirements traceability. This talks about requirements traceability. As I just said, this is about testing requirements traceability, not just the requirements traceability Paul talked about, and he'll do support on that. Just regular reporting, and we'll include that in the guidance and what we want to see, and we can agree how regular that is. And obviously the key to this is the completion report. This is just a bit on, I'd just like to add something that's not on here around migration. Obviously, as you go through SIT, so we acknowledge that migration related testing may be ongoing when they enter SIT component integration testing and functional. So that's a key thing that we recognise and will support you through. That was it from a PIT perspective. Any questions?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel. So moving on to systems integration testing. Over to you, Dom. And Dom, I think just a reminder as you go through this, perhaps you could just be very clear with everyone in terms of which is information that's additional to the implementation approach.
Sure. Morning, everyone. For those of you that I haven't met, my name's Dominic Mooney. I'm the SIT lead on the programme. Thanks, Joe. So overview of SIT. So as Nigel mentioned, one of the core elements is obviously evidence pre-integration testing, which is intended to prove functional, non-functional, migration-related characteristics of your systems and processes for those that are electing to participate in SIT. So this will be for central systems, suppliers, core systems and DIP interfaces, metering services, data services, and registration, network operations, and UMSO services. As we've mentioned, this stage is obviously executed in a participant's own environment, and it will be a key prerequisite amongst other readiness criteria for entering to SIT. The SIT testing itself is going to be based on scenarios that are specified by the SI, and it will be to demonstrate functional, non-functional, migration-related characteristics of the market interfaces and services in an integrated SIT environment. So, slightly covering what we've gone through before, but participants are expected to produce PIT test artifacts, so test approach plan, RTM, scenario scripts, and also a completion report and execution evidence, which will be assured, and also a readiness report. So this is less focused on the PIT, but more associated with the readiness for the SIT testing itself. So in terms of environments, data, and any detailed test steps that are associated with your own systems that you've built into the overarching scenario and scripts. As an SI, we'll be assuring test readiness of SIT entrants. We'll be providing a test approach and plan, which we'll be developing in the SIT working group. We'll also be providing an overarching test data approach and plan, but also test data approaches and plans specific to each stage. We'll be specifying the scenarios and scripts for SIT, and that's obviously going to be based on the design. And as we've mentioned, we'll be verifying PIT exit criteria have been met in order to enter into the SIT. And then during SIT, we'll be assuring the SIT results, and we'll be ensuring the availability of the relevant test harnesses, coordinating the test environment setup and support, and the appropriate data against which each participant will be testing in SIT. We'll be managing the SIP process and schedule through the execution, and we'll be providing access and training guidance on the MHHS test management tool, which is going to be ADO. And in addition to that, we'll be providing the overall defect and issue management for all centrally raised issues, and that will include their triage and coordination of fix releases. There'll be associated deliverables. I've mentioned the approach and plan and the test data approach and plan. And we'll be asking each participant to provide a readiness report for entry into SIT, but then the SI will also produce an overarching SIT readiness report, which will be the subject of assurance and governance on the lead up to the start of component integration test. And that model will be applied to each test stage. So we'll be ensuring that the readiness of each stage is properly assured and governed. We'll also be providing a defect management plan and test management tool user guide. Not mentioned on here, we also have exit reports as well for each stage. A breakdown of all the planned test deliverables has been provided in the last SIT working group. So I recommend if you want further detail, you can go to the papers for the last working group and see what's expected there. Joe, if you don't mind moving on. So as Keith mentioned and Giles, the concept of the minimum viable cohort. So the MVC is essentially the minimum group of SIT participants which we need in order to, in a coordinated manner, exercise the full SIT scope. The purpose is going to be to ensure that the arrangements function correctly and have been implemented in accordance with the design. And the MVC will enable us to, as we say, exercise the solution as quickly as possible. The composition of the MVC will be all of the central systems, and then at least one of the following in terms of LDSOs. So St. Clement's and the DNOs obviously providing MPRS, DNOs providing network operations and UMSO services, and all supplier agents providing DCDA MOP services for migration testing. And we also need at least 2 of service providers for metering services. For metering services advanced, smart data services, advanced data services, UMS data services, and at least 2 suppliers. Now this slide was in the implementation approach pack, but based on some feedback, I've put in another slide today just that elaborates on these points and hopefully makes it a bit clearer. So Joe, if you don't mind moving on. Thank you. So in terms of onboarding into SIT, the planning assumptions as they stand are, as we've mentioned, we're asking participants to inform the programme in their consultation response of their intention to volunteer for SIT by the end of January. And if possible, if participants are able by the 16th, in order that can go into PSG. Following which the programme will be doing some assurance on delivery plans that we receive in those consultation responses, and we'll be working to a milestone of the 23rd of April, where we're going to identify all the SIT candidates that are going to be moving into the SIT phase. I just want to point out at this phase that at this point there's going to be no distinction between the MVC and other SIT participants. So essentially you'll be volunteering for SIT, and when we move into SIT, we'll want to move at the speed of the fastest. And so when we've identified that we've actually formed an MVC, at that stage we would then prioritise the MVC's test execution objectives so that we can move through and exercise the coverage as quickly as possible, and therefore meet the plan. But we will be at the same time supporting other SIT participants through that process, and providing additional time within the plan to enable that. As we mentioned earlier, currently the plan indicates a target to complete PIT by the 29th of September. This will enable a month of assurance and governance ahead of the planned sit start of the 30th of October. Through CIT, we're planning to progressively integrate participants, starting with the DIP and Helix and then MPRS, and then we'll integrate other roles in 2-week intervals. And this sequence is being developed in the SIT working group at the moment. Obviously, it's a given that all SIT participants will be expected to demonstrate their PIT completion and SIT readiness prior to SIT CIT commencement. To Chris's point earlier, obviously, if you can indicate to us your likely confidence to be able to meet that 29th date or not, we can take that into account and have discussions with you on that. So last entrance to CIT will therefore be CIT end minus 2 weeks. So that will be the 29th of January. At that point, we won't be expecting to bring in any more SIT participants after the end of CIT. So the MVC. So the MVC is going to be based on the composition criteria that I outlined on the previous slide. Following SIT CIT, the progress of all participants will be monitored in SIT functional. And as we see those participants that are forming the MVC are starting to move ahead, we will prioritise the MVC objectives within the SIT functional phase, and we'll continue to do that through the other stages as well. And essentially, we'll be looking at highest number of tests that have been successfully executed, lowest number of SEV 1s and 2s. We'll also take into account any 3s to 5s as well. And then we'll continue to maintain that MVC via periodic review points. It may be dynamic as well, so if certain participants in the MVC for various reasons start to fall behind, and there are other participants that in the other SIT participants swim lane that are getting ahead successfully, then we may change the composition of the MVC. What we're recommending to all participants is that in SIT B, where we're going to be carrying out SIT migration, SIT NFT and SIT operational testing, that all participants aim to start the test stages at the same time. And the reason for that is we want to mitigate any scheduling constraints that may mean that other participants would fall behind, because we are going to have to balance the priorities of the MVC, but also a degree of overlap of those test stages. But as I mentioned, all participants outside of the MVC will be given additional time and support within the environment up until the 7th of April. Any SIT participant that drops out of SIT, just to note, would have to then proceed down the non-SIT route. Now, we have been talking to the co-delivery bodies about the principle of credit being allowed for any execution that's been covered in SIT, and the co-delivery bodies are comfortable with that principle, but that will be fleshed out in a bit more detail in the qualification working group. Joe, if you don't mind just going on to the next slide. So just depicting that in a plan on a page view. So this is slightly different from the plan on a page that we put in the pack, only in the sense that it depicts the swim lane for other participants. So I'll just talk you through each stage. So we've got SIT CIT test execution going from the 30th of October to the 9th of February 24. As we've discussed, we'll be progressively integrating parties throughout that phase. We've got the SIT functional start milestone on the 27th of February. As I say, at this stage, this will be all participants volunteering for SIT, so no distinction between MVC and other participants at this stage. We've then broken down the functional testing into 3 main cycles. So in cycle 1, the target will be to execute as much of the coverage as possible, obviously allowing for a certain amount of defects that will be fleshed out within that testing. There will then be a short period where a defect fix release, any assurance and data environments maintenance is taking place. And then we will move into cycle 2, and then we will have a third and final cycle with the intention that we will reach a core systems code freeze by the 21st of October 24, following which there will be a period of regression testing on that code freeze release. And we'll be seeking to complete the SIP functional end for the MVC by the 3rd of January 25. And as I mentioned, subsequent to that, there will be a continued period of time where other participants will be supported to complete any coverage that they need to up until the 7th of April. And then we've got SIP migration running from the 10th of June through to the 7th of October 24. Again, I've depicted the other PP swim lane in there as well. And then we've got NFT starting on the 2nd of September through to the 3rd of January 25. And again, the other PPs there continue to be supported until the 7th of April. And then we've got SIP operations testing starting on the 7th of October through to the 24th of Jan. And then all SIP participants are going to be targeted for completion by the 21st of April 25. I've also depicted on here, which may or may not have been on the original POPE in the pack, how this relates to the non-SIP testing stages. So we mentioned earlier that we've got a proposal to run testing for non-SIP LDSOs alongside the later stages of SIP functional. This will include functional migration, NFT and ops. So this is going to be all those LDSOs that are not part of SIT. And the intention is to run this testing in an equivalence to the qualification testing that's going to be required for those parties in order to be able to support the M11 milestone. Originally in the round 2 plan, we had this testing being executed within tranche 1 of qualification. The difference in round 3 is that we've realised we would need to bring that testing forward in order to maintain the date for M11. And we're looking to start that testing slightly at risk, but hopefully with some confidence at the beginning of cycle 2 of functional testing. And that will run through to January 25. As we successfully reach the code freeze for the core systems, this is where we're planning to then kick off the end-to-end sandbox execution testing. So that'll be shortly after on the 22nd of October. And once we've run SIP functional for the MVC and run through a sufficient level of the migration, NFT and operational testing, we'll be looking to start the qualification execution from the 20th of January 25. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dom. Are there any questions for Dom? I know there's quite a lot of material that we've covered in there. Yeah, just keen to make sure that you have any questions. Probably now is probably a good time to ask them while we're in this part of the pack. Chris.
Yes, I'll just a really quick one. In terms of like the test harnesses and all of the test support that you said, is all of that cost within the program cost, or will there be any additional cost to participants?
That cost is all within the program, I believe. So that's all of the SIMs and Ms that we're producing centrally. Obviously, any additional test harnesses that you might want to use within your own testing is obviously a cost that will be borne by a participant. But there's no intention to cross-charge that, I believe, unless anyone on the program team there has a different view.
We're shaking our head in here, Dom. Just
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Thanks, Dom.
Any more questions around SIT? Okay, thanks, Dom. We'll move on to qualification. Jason.
Okay, for those of you who have not, let me put my camera on, apologies. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Jason Brogden. I work in the central programme team at the LDP here, and particularly involved in qualification and the code drafting elements, but across the rest of the programme as well. So I'll cover those two items today. And a number of people have referenced qualification already, particularly around the testing element. So I'll give an overview around qualification, what it'll include, and hopefully drop to a bit of further detail around the planning for qualification that's been referenced against the high level plan from Giles earlier. What I would say is, in line with the briefings for SIT and other development work, what we presented in the implementation approach and supporting evidence for qualification is a snapshot of the best view on qualification that we had at the time. There is a lot of work going on in the qualification working group to continue to develop the arrangements for qualification, and to continue to challenge some of the assumptions that we've made in planning in qualification. And importantly, you'll see in the responsibilities along the bottom, the majority of the responsibility for qualification will sit with the code bodies, particularly around specifying scenarios and data and executing the processes themselves. Now, we are expecting them to build on the work that we've been doing on SIT, where Dom and Nigel have both talked about the equivalence that is being assumed for qualification from SIT testing. So we have a body of work that's being done under SIT for testing, and we'll expect to build on that, but it is going to be the responsibility of the code delivery bodies to take that forward, and there's a lot of work being done by them, progress through the SIT working group. So the assumptions that underpinned the plan for qualification is that we would have 4 key elements around qualification. The first is procedural and governance, which is the equivalent of the self-assessment document and documentation and the processes that currently sit within the code bodies. And we would expect a similar process to be followed for qualification for MHHS. And that procedural element we have, or you'll see in the plan that we have planned for that to be able to be started well in advance of actually executing any testing, to give us as good a chance as possible of completing those qualification activities early. Historically, it has taken some time to go through that procedural and governance process at the code bodies. The next 3 are really a build on what Nigel and Dom have been talking through around SIT. We will look to have pre-integration testing PIT evidence provided to enter qualification, and that's part of the pre-qual guidance that's under development at the moment. And we will be looking for evidence of testing in order to exit qualification for DBT2 activities, so for the consequential change activities that are required to support MHHS. We'll be looking for evidence as an exit criterion from qualification. So that can be done in parallel with the DBT1 qualification testing that will be done as per the plan in the tranches. And number 4 is the actual execution of that qualification testing. As I said earlier, we are expecting the execution of SIT testing to provide equivalence for that qualification testing. But for those parties who haven't been through SIT, we will expect a set of tests to be executed in order to prove qualification for the roles that are being taken through that qualification process. And we are expecting to build on the SIT scenarios and coverage, but we are expecting it to be a subset because we're looking at qualification on a role-by-role basis rather than the testing of the end-to-end processes, which is what we are undertaking in SIT. So we'll be looking at the responsibilities. It will be participants' responsibility to ensure the successful completion of qualification, and it will be a prerequisite of entering migration to have qualified. So when we look at the plan, we're expecting the self-assessment processes to run in parallel with that, executing the tests in order to provide the evidence to go to performance assurance boards to get sign off that you're a qualified party and able to stand up your prod environments and start your migration processes. The SI, we are providing the test harnesses that Chris asked about earlier. We are looking to support the test management and provide any test services to support the code bodies. But as I said earlier, the majority of the responsibilities sit with the code bodies, and the final sign off of qualification will sit with performance assurance boards. So I think that probably gives a good summary across the overview for qualification. We are working on the pre-qual guidance at the moment. As I've said, there will be a qualification approach and plan, which is being worked at currently through the QWG. And again, I would stress the importance of attending the qualification working group to provide your input into that approach and plan, and then the next level of detail into the test scenarios and test data. Any questions on the overview? Okay, Joe, if we move into the plan itself. Okay, so the blue bars in the middle cover the qualification activities. The top bar is our general testing preparation activity that's being undertaken through the QWG, where we are preparing the test scenarios, the test scripts, any test data, and all of those preparatory activities. That is a very summary activity. There is a breakdown of further activities in the MPP, and we do have the key milestone for approving the qualification test approach and plan in May this year. So that is a key development through the QWG. As I said, we are planning to start the SAD process early. Once we have the qualification code drafting baseline, and then the qualification testing process follows SIP functional, as was highlighted in the summary plans earlier. So you'll see SIP functional ends in the yellow bar above, and qualification testing starts. And as Giles said, we are assuming 6 months. We're assuming 6 months of qualification testing. There are 7 tranches assumed for those 6 months of testing, and then we're allowing a 2-month period after completion of text execution to go through PAB approval and stand-up production environments before participants can then drop into migration. And Giles showed that critical path for sort of first tranche and second and last tranche of qualification, and then that links down into migration below. Yeah, Lee.
Hi, Jason.
Hi.
So questions from the supplier side now, not from Helix. So just in terms of the tranches for qualification,
Yeah.
is it the qualification approach where those tranches are going to be defined?
I think
who goes in them?
Yeah, what Alexon are getting to grips with at the moment is how might we allocate parties into those tranches. At the moment, the BSc says that the allocation, that the qualification must be undertaken in a non-discriminatory way. So Alexon are thinking on what does that mean in practical terms for how we allocate parties into tranches. So I don't have an answer for that at the moment, but it's part of the work that needs to be covered under the QWG, and I would expect any criteria to be defined in that approach and plan.
I think that approach plan is due to come out in May, so I guess by May we'll have that answer, won't we?
Yeah, and it's being thought about at the moment. It'll be developed through the qualification working group. So Alexon will provide their view on what that means and what the implications are. We'll support them obviously from a program perspective, but all of your input will be really important to that through the QWG process.
And does the same go for the SAD process, that will be tranched up as well?
It's a good question. I don't think that's how it's practically going to work. I think that the SAD, I think you can basically apply to start your SAD process as soon as you are ready and as soon as the code drafting is complete, and it'll be the test execution element of that will feed into the PAB approval at the end. But you should be able to do the administrative bit early and get that ready early. That's why we've kicked that off earlier than the testing, because experience has proven that it does take some time to go through that governance and administrative process.
Okay, cool. Cheers, Jason. Thanks.
Thanks, Luke. Any other questions for Jason on qualification? Okay, thanks, Jason. I think you're doing the next.
Oh no, there's another question from Adam.
Oh, sorry, missed that. Sorry,
Jason, just a quick question you've probably answered a million times already. So if a supplier was using a software provider from a qualification perspective, and that provider has qualified their systems for another MPID in that same role, to what extent can a supplier then rely upon that sort of testing and qualification that's already been undertaken?
Yeah, so we're looking to provide some equivalence for software providers. We are expecting people to qualify on a role by role basis. Yeah. So we're not expecting that to meet everything. And at this point, we haven't got a firm view on exactly what that equivalence might look like, Adam. But we have, from the beginning, we've been trying to support a principle of equivalence, but we don't have that level of detail as to how that is exactly going to look at the moment, and that will be progressed through the QWG and from a SIT perspective through the SIT working group as well, because it may be that we have SIT participants with multiple common software providers that again we may be able to get some equivalence from, but both of those elements open for discussion at SIT and qualification working group.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, Jason, we do have both of those topics on the SIT working group agenda for this afternoon. So we're going to be exploring those ideas there.
Oh, thank you.
Right, thanks, Tom. Obviously, that we've got quite a lot of common material that's being progressed through the SIT working group and the qualification working group. Nigel and I were having a discussion about it earlier because there's a lot of commonality, particularly around the test execution. So it's important that we keep the two well joined up for the topics for discussion. You can't see Nigel nodding at me from the other side of the table here, but he is. So again, without risk of sounding like a broken record, we really would welcome all of your input into the SIT working group and QWG discussions.
Okay, no more questions for Jason on qualification. I think we move on to regulatory and code drafting. Jason, back with you.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for moving this on. So yes, code drafting. The scope of the code drafting work stream is to deliver all of the drafting that's required in the relevant codes to deliver MHHS, and particularly into BSc Rec, DCUSA, and CUSC. I won't elaborate on the acronyms, but those are the codes that are required to be changed for MHHS. There is a change from round 2 of the replan because we have had change request 12 approved in the interim, which brings in code drafting for consequential change items into the programme code drafting activities. So you'll see that there is a new topic area for consequential change in the code drafting work stream that allows for a coherent and consolidated set of code drafting to cover consequential change, as well as the translation of the design set out in our design baseline. We are looking to manage the scope of that activity by baselining a set of consequential change that we will take into account. And we're looking to baseline that at the end of January. We're looking at that through the CCIAG and through the CCAG to ensure that we're able to manage scope of consequential change. We've included in our code drafting work stream the Ofgem powers that are required to enact and enable the code drafting. At the moment, we have been talking to Ofgem about what powers get used, and we think it's likely to be the significant code review powers at the moment. So that is what's reflected in the plan. but that is subject to ongoing discussion with Andy, Jenny, and Sinead and the team. Those I can see on the call. And what we've done with the implementation date, again, this is a change from round 2, because, and one that we did call out actually in the round 2 assumptions. We are aligning the implementation date for code changes to align with M10 when central parties are ready for migration. And the reason for doing that is it enables us to operate our slightly more dynamic change management processes. If there are code changes that come in later in the process, we can administer them under our program governance rather than having to rely on some of the more onerous and longer BAU code governance processes that apply to all of the codes. So we can be a bit more nimble in updating the code baseline before implementation, and it gives us a little more control. So that's why we have put the implementation date to align with M10 now. So we're managing the work stream for code drafting. We're providing a lot of the support services, but the code bodies are looking at completing the drafting of their codes from the design artifacts of consequential change, with the exception of the BSC changes, which are being drafted under the programme. And we have a well-defined review and governance and consultation process that I'll show in the next slides that ensure that we get that industry input as we go. As I said, Ofgem will use code designation powers as appropriate, and we have a number of deliverables around the code drafting, including, importantly, traceability matrix that will trace the design artifacts left to right to the code drafting, but also go right to left and demonstrate where our code drafting is reflecting the design. So that should give us that assurance of completeness of code drafting. Joe, if you move on, I'll whistle through the next couple because I know we're a bit short on time. There's not a great change to the timescales associated with code drafting, but we have included a new topic, I, for consequential change, that has resulted in an extension to M6 in the latest round of the Replan. This doesn't sit on the critical path, as Giles said earlier, therefore we can comfortably accommodate that additional work that was proposed in Change Request 12. And the next slide, Joe, if you move on, just shows the typical development, consultation and review life cycle associated with all the code artifacts. And again, you've seen those before in previous rounds. We're just reflected that in the new round 3 replan. So Joe, I think that's my last slide for code drafting, but I see Chris has his hand up.
Just a really quick question, Jason. Just in terms of expectations from a round 3 point of view, from a large supplier outlook, clearly the majority of the expectations are on the code bodies to kind of do the legal text, etc. And our element is just review. So is that really your expectation, is that we validate the timelines for review rather than the whole timelines?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. You know, I think from a supplier perspective, are you there and ready and mobilised and able to review the scale of the changes that are coming through in the consultation windows we've set out? What we've tried to do in our planning, you'll see in the MPP, is not overlap the consultation periods wherever we can, and to try and give you that staggered opportunity to undertake the consultation and review. And then we have the activities in the code drafting working group where you have the opportunity to provide input, and then obviously your representation at CCAG to sign them off.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to move on because I'm very conscious of time and Aid being squeezed in the last 2 sections. So Aid, I think without further ado, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Giles. For those that don't know me, my name's Adrian Page. I'm SI lead here on the half-hourly programme, and I wanted to pick up the topics of migration and then post-live support just as we to finish the plan off before we open up for any more Q&A. So having completed SIT, all qualification suppliers are in a position to start migrating their MPANs, and to do that, the main activities that are associated with the preparation for that are outlined in the implementation approach, and there's no new material here being shared to what we sent out before Christmas in the Replan. And as before, I'd like to just reiterate the two working groups that we're using really to develop these. So we've got the migration design subgroup, which is reports to DAG, which, as it says on the tin there, are developing the design for the migration, including reverse migration. And if any parties aren't already participating in that, I would strongly encourage you to get involved in those sessions. John Wiggins is leading that from my perspective here within the programme. And then the other group is the migration working group that Carly Ward's leading. And in that migration working group, we're going through the migration approach, strategy. We shared a high-level model, which I'll just speak about again in a minute at the meeting just before Christmas. And we're then also starting to look at data assessment within that, will be within that group at this week's meeting, which I will just plug for Thursday afternoon of this week. So the key activities then are those that's the design, the migration approach, and then it will be the execution of that. If we just go forward one slide, I would just say a few things about the expectations we currently have on migration. And the migration at the moment is, we've modelled that from a central perspective and need engagement from all you guys and from the other energy suppliers. But we're expecting there to be 3 phases to that, as is described here on the left-hand side. So initially there'll be a ramp-up stage as people start to put meters through. They'll be putting through MPANs from their perspective. This would be people who've been through SIT. And there's some a couple of assumptions there that I just wanted to highlight. One being that we've got a good number of MPANs to choose from SIT, and as we get the passes through SIT participation at the end of January this year, we'll be able to visit that assumption as to whether it's right. And as we reiterated earlier, LDSOs are all been through and are ready to receive meters, so we have no geographic restriction there. We'll then expect about 12 months, 10 months of full-scale ramp-up, where we're expecting the vast majority to go through, and we're assuming that we won't be restricted by any system restrictions or regulatory restrictions there with regard to the number of meters we can go through, and we're discussing that within the working group. And then experience of all of us will say that there's always a tail to any migration, and that will be the final 5%, let's say, of MPANs through that will come through, and we need all of those MPANs through to reach that M15 goal. So that's the key elements of that. As I say, we've got an Excel spreadsheet that sits behind that we've been through at the migration working group. Just to put some timeline on that on the next slide, Joe. That means that we're looking at April 2025, so just over 2 years from now, that we'll be able to start the initial migration there. And we're allowing 18 months, as Giles referred to at the beginning of the meeting here now, rather than the 12 months that was in the previous pack. And then there's a stagger for the other people joining who've come through qualification. So starting September 25 and completing in both cases through to October 26. So they were the key things I just wanted to highlight there from a migration perspective. Adam, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi Adrian. So just a quick question. Can we be absolutely clear on, in terms of the migration commencement dates? You've got sort of migration for the SIT MVC commencing April, there with migration other commencing in September. Where do other SIT parties, which of those pots do other SIT parties sit in? Is it within the SIT MVC route, or is it in the migration other pots?
I think it's fair to say that those start dates are aligned with the people coming out, the first people coming out of the MVC, and for those people coming out of qualification, other people will come in between April the 7th and the 30th of September on there if they're coming through other SIT. And as Jason referred to, from a qualification perspective, we're seeing 7 tranches of that, so we will see people dropping in from the 30th of September onwards.
Okay, so you have some parties dropping in between those dates for migration commencement. Is that what you're saying? Based upon, so if I was a SIT other participant not within the MVC,
Yeah.
am I commencing migration from 7th of April, 30th of September, or somewhere in between that?
I think you'd be in between the two. You're in that top bar, Adam, but you're not April the 7th. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Conscious of time here, so just to finish up then, Joe. Oh, Naomi.
Sorry, Adrian, I couldn't click the right buttons at the right time. So just to follow up from Adam's question, so as I understand it, MVC is I think programme construct, which was the phrase used to, and so parties may fall into it and out of it dependent on the programme requirements at that point in time. So you might not, my understanding of that is that you might not intend to go into SIT MVC, but you might get pulled into it because you're kind of doing well, or that meets whatever the programme needs. That could potentially then impact what kind of migration timescales and kind of how does that, if that MVC part isn't a binding kind of isn't a binding obligation or a binding requirement, how has the knock-on impact then to further stages such as this? So Adam's question around if I'm not MVC or I am MVC, how does that kind of play out in the later stages of delivery, migration being one of them? Keith, I think this follows on from a conversation we were having at the end of last week, where you kind of explained that MVC bit a little bit more to us, which was helpful. But that demarcation, does this route depend on whether or not you were MVC at the final day of testing or MVC at the outset of testing, or if you've kind of come in or out of it, what do you kind of identify as?
Naomi, I think the point is that whether you're in the MVC at the end or not is it's important from the programme, as you say, from the programme perspective. We need to get the end of SIT, and the participants who reach the end of SIT earliest and are there at the end are nominally MVC, but you've got other participants coming through SIT who are probably quite close behind, and that was the point that I'm answering Adam's question about the fact that migration could start relatively soon after for those non-SIT, for those SIT other participants. The MVC will be to a certain extent fluid, but I mean obviously it's unlikely to be that changeable. MVC through SIT is going to be reasonably static and locked in, but we want to allow for the fact that some participants may drop out because they've reached blockages and may fall behind, and other participants then can come in to provide some contingency and mitigate the risk of the whole SIT process being slowed up. So I wouldn't get too obsessed about it from that perspective. What the important thing is that we get to the end of SIT with a viable cohort of participants who should be ready, provided from a supplier perspective, as we discussed, you need to have your related service providers, agents and service providers there with you in order to start migration, and hopefully gone through SIT as well, but they may or may not be part of the MVC. So there's a certain amount of you need to be ready with your related organisations to start to go live. And if you're in MVC, but that's more about getting through SIT essentially in order to be ready for going live. As we discussed last week, you'll have your go live cohort of yourself and your related service providers who then can together start migrating. So
for the purposes of this then, where I would, so if a party was aiming for the sit or the pot, or you'd read this and anticipate that you would track slightly behind the sit MVC part. So when considering what timescales you can meet, is that the right interpretation?
Yeah, but ideally it wouldn't be that far behind.
No. Yeah, marginally.
This diagram probably will say migration sit, migration other.
Yeah, I mean, what we were,
the MVC is a bit of a distraction.
what we were trying to show is that people who've been through SIT can start from the 7th of April, we're assuming.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's 18 months. And if someone's been through qualification, there would be a delay and they wouldn't be able to start until the 30th of September. As you know, as we say, we'll develop that further and we can expand that out as we go through the working groups and understand that. We've got the facility to, we all, I think, want the facility to offer people to migrate as early as they can and to benefit from being able to start having MPANs in the new settlement arrangements.
Understood, thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay, so Joe, just, it's only 2 minutes, I think. So just at the end here, conscious that there's some activities that sit within that final readiness for live operations, and we just pulled them out in this one pager on here, which again is in the implementation approach. First couple of bullets on there at the top there are saying that, you know, all parties, whether that's an energy supplier or whether that's a central party, will need to have some service management in place to enable them to support their arrangements in the live system. And we recognise that during the migration, there'll be some additional service management arrangements that need to be in place, and obviously we've got reverse migration to consider with that in that as well. And then the final point I was just going to make is that we're very conscious of the data there, and we've got both the data assessment work within the migration we're doing, and then some sort of validation of live data there to make sure that it's satisfactory and meeting all the various requirements that are in there. And that will be enough, I think, bearing in mind the time, just to make sure we've got 5 minutes to open up for general questions.
Thank you, Aidan. Okay, so as Aidan very kindly led me in. So we've got probably just 5 minutes left of the call for any sort of wrap up questions that anybody might have. See any hands up? Okay. Lee?
Yeah, just I guess a question of the principle of the plan. I guess there are still some unknowns as we go through this. We know from the perspective of SIT and working through the scope of that. Same with kind of qualification. So it's going to be some time until there's more certainty, which is typical with large programs, isn't it? You have greater certainty up front. So is the principle of this plan that the related timescales, say qualification example, that's going to be a fixed amount of time, and the approach will be we'll have to reduce the scope to fit within that timeline? So is it a fixed timeline approach versus a kind of an approach where we'd be changing the timeline if we found that more time was needed for some of the related activities?
What we're doing on, I'll pick qualification as an example, Lee, because it's the one you've referred to. We're actually in dialogue with Alexon to see whether that is a practical and sensible set of assumptions to underpin the timings. So, and we should be able to conclude that by the time we come round with our next version of the plan. So in parallel with this consultation, we're in dialogue to see, is 6 months practical given the scope and the scale of what we're doing and the number of participants that we're going to be bringing through. So it's not fixed at the moment. It is our best assumption on the basis of the knowledge we've got, but we will have a much better view having gone through those discussions with Alexon.
Yeah, and so we've got other questions from an EDF perspective, but we'll put those in the response. And we'll kind of raise the relevant risks associated with those, because this is a version of the plan, isn't it? We want to get to re-baseline, but there may be some changes to the plan going forwards as we get more detailed information from the related activities.
Yeah, any input you've got that will help us refine our assumptions is gratefully received. Yeah.
All right, cool. Cheers.
Chief, are you going to say something additional there or not? I thought I was about to say something and then stop.
No, I was going to suggest, just ask Graham if you felt that the session was fulfilling the needs of the community before we kind of close off. Graham, have you got any kind of final comments?
Thanks, Keith. I don't think so. I think it's really helpful as normal. Obviously, all suppliers have been on. They've asked the questions they've got, and everybody's committed to provide their responses. So if we've got anything in the meantime between now and submission of responses, then we'll let you know.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Graham. And as probably everybody's aware, there's a PMO mailbox, and we'll distribute any queries that we get into the team and respond accordingly. We'll also the recording will be uploaded to the portal, and we'll also distribute the presentation here, because there will be changes from the implementation approach. We will just make sure that the slides that have differed in any way are clearly annotated as such, so you can so you've got a record of that. That just leaves me to thank you for your time this morning. We've covered a lot of ground, as I say. I'm sure if there are additional questions, please let us know. But thank you again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Cheers, thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thanks.